Our next presentation is going to be from Shivali Vyas, who is getting her master's degree in neurobiology in Boston University and has come to talk about stress and how to regulate stress in a positive direction. Please welcome Shivali.
Hello, everyone. I am Shivali Vyas, and I'm a first-year master's student studying anatomy and neurobiology over at Boston University. Now, as a student studying neuroscience, I think I'm in a really unique position because just like everyone else, I experience a lot of stress, whether that be from studying for exams or preparing for talks like this one. However, as a student studying neuroscience, I've learned about stress and how stress can impact different aspects of our life. I kind of think of it as having my cake and eating it too, except the cake doesn't taste that good and it comes with the side of overanalyzing the recipe, because not only do I experience stress, I then stress about being stressed, knowing how it can impact my overall health. So let's take a step back. What is stress, right? Well, stress is a natural human reaction to any change or challenge in your environment, and sadly, it's an unavoidable part of our daily lives. The key player with stress is a hormone called cortisol, and cortisol is regulated by something called the HPA axis. The HPA axis comprises of 3 different components working together to regulate the cortisol in your blood. These 3 components are your hypothalamus and your pituitary glands in your brain, and your adrenal glands that sit on top of each of your kidneys. How this works is an environmental stressor is picked up and communicated to your hypothalamus. When your hypothalamus receives this signal, it then produces its own hormone called CRH. CRH then goes down to your pituitary glands and signals that to produce its own hormone called ACTH. ACTH then travels all the way down to your adrenal glands where cortisol is produced. Now this whole system acts as a negative feedback loop, where if the levels of cortisol get too high in your body, cortisol can actually go back and inhibit the production of CRH and ACTH in your hypothalamus and pituitary glands. This is extremely important because any dysfunction in this system can push all of it into the state of hyperactivity. And when that happens, it can cause a lot of detrimental effects in those downstream processes associated with cortisol. And that's why understanding the neuroscience behind these topics is very interesting and important, because it can really help to mitigate the effects of daily stressors that we all face. And that's what I want to talk to you all about today. So I've talked about downstream effects of cortisol a few times now, but what exactly are they, right? Well, there's a lot, but the 3 that I want to focus on today are learning and memory, sleep, and the gut brain. And I want to start off by talking about learning and memory, because these processes are at the foundation of everything we do every single day, whether that be learning a new skill or recalling a cherished childhood memory. We use these systems in our day-to-day life. Now, a lot of people think that stress has a negative impact on learning and memory, but the reality is a little more complicated than that. Studies have found that when subjects were exposed to acute stress before or after a learning activity such as studying, it actually improved their memory. If you think about this, it makes sense because our brains are wired to remember emotionally salient information. So much so, in fact, that in one of my classes, we learned that there's a special pathway dedicated to this, which is called the spinoreticular tract. This tract picks up painful stimuli and takes a shortcut up to your brain. Your brain creates a strong emotional association with that memory, so that the next time you're in a similar situation, your brain knows how to better handle and avoid the situation. Now, here clearly, acute stress is good. It's the chronic stress that can cause detrimental effects. So the study exposed their participants to a prolonged period of elevated cortisol levels, and what they found was this negatively impaired their learning ability. Similarly, when they exposed them to an environmental stressor before a retrieval event, such as a big test or exam, testing what they'd learned previously, it also negatively impaired their memory. Now, as students, we're all constantly building on prior knowledge, and this is a process of reconsolidation. And the study looked at that too, and what they found was that when their subjects were exposed to a stressor before a reconsolidation event, that again negatively impacted their performance. So clearly now stress has a very complicated relationship with the processes of learning and memory. So how do we take this complex topic and apply it to our daily lives? Well, studies have found that exercising can actually increase your cortisol levels for up to a few hours after that period of activity. So the next time you sit down to study or learn something new, it might actually be beneficial to get a quick little workout in. That being said, before a big exam or a particularly difficult class, you want to keep those cortisol levels nice and low. So in that scenario, it's important to prioritize rest and relaxation. Now, speaking of rest, the next thing I want to talk about is sleep. Sleep is modulated by your circadian rhythms, and these play a very important role in modulating your sleep-wake cycles. Now, the key player with sleep is a hormone that is responsible for making you feel sleepy, which we all may have heard is called melatonin. Now, melatonin is really interesting because it's actually light dependent. Light can come in and activate a region of your hypothalamus, and that inhibits or stops the production of further melatonin. So, as we can infer, melatonin levels will be higher later on in the day and at night when there's less light. But let's take a step back. I said hypothalamus plays an important role in melatonin pathways, but also your HPA axis from the first slide I showed you. So clearly, cortisol and melatonin are extremely interconnected. And while melatonin levels are higher later on at night, cortisol levels are actually at their highest earlier in the day when you wake up, and they deplete throughout the day. So for a show of hands, raise your hand if you've ever experienced a hard time falling asleep after a particularly stressful day. Yes, I see a lot of hands because we've all been there. We've all experienced that interconnectedness between melatonin and cortisol. Studies have found that elevated levels of cortisol actually lead to a suppression of melatonin production. Suppression of melatonin then leads to poor sleep quality and duration. But here's the catch. Poor sleep then leads to more increased levels of cortisol. So it quickly becomes this really vicious cycle that we really want to try and avoid. So how do we do that? Well, as I mentioned before, prioritizing rest and relaxation is really important for this exact reason. It helps prevent unnecessary peaks in your cortisol. Going off of that, scheduling cortisol-inducing activities such as exercising for earlier in the day when you're already going to have higher levels of cortisol helps prevent an unnecessary peak later on in the day when your levels are supposed to be lower. Going off of that, surrounding yourself with dim light or eliminating or limiting blue light exposure for the hours leading up to going to sleep is really important to allow for that melatonin to build up and allow for a good night's rest. So, our knowledge of the circadian rhythms and cortisol cycles and melatonin cycles is really important for helping to eliminate unnecessary peaks in cortisol that we all face day to day. Now, the last thing I want to talk about today is the gut brain. The gut brain is this fascinating new avenue of research. And if you've ever felt something like butterflies in your stomach, or a gut feeling about something, or the thought of giving a talk is really gut-wrenching, that is your enteric nervous system or your gut brain at play. This complex neuronal network has more neurons than the entirety of your spinal cord combined, and it can actually function independently of your actual brain without any inputs. That being said, using something called the gut microbiome, or the bacteria that are in your gut, it can influence your overall health and mood by modulating the levels of neurotransmitters and hormones, including cortisol. Now, the two bacteria at play here with cortisol are called Bifidobacterium and Lactobacillus. These are found in your large intestine, and together they work together to produce something called short-chain fatty acids. These short-chain fatty acids can essentially go up and cross the blood-brain barrier and directly impact the HPA axis in your brain and modulate the levels of cortisol in your blood. We've all heard of the phrase, "you are what you eat," but the extent of this phrase is only now being realized by the ongoing research happening in the gut brain. Specifically with these two bacteria, they're found in fermented foods or probiotics that are in yogurts. That being said, it's also important to focus on an overall well-rounded diet to keep that gut brain functioning as it should and your enteric nervous system working properly. So, speaking of food, let's go back to my cortisol cake. Stress is an inevitable part of our daily lives, and we all deal with it. But using our knowledge of the neuroscience behind it can help us to take small, actionable steps in our daily life to mitigate the effects of stress that we all face. Things such as prioritizing rest, or synchronizing activities with our natural circadian rhythms, or focusing on a well-rounded diet can all help work together to produce and promote overall health. So while I still may stress about being stressed, maybe the recipe of the cortisol cake really isn't that confusing after all. If we use our knowledge of the ingredients, we can live a healthier, smarter, and more intentional life, and hopefully your cortisol cake ends up tasting a lot better. Thank you.